Mike Bayo, Area 2 Planning, presenting here at the Planning Board meeting June 23rd, 2016, regarding the revised Johnson annexation X70672015. The site is located along Darnestown Road, west of Quince Orchard in Gaithersburg, Maryland. It consists of approximately 23.45 acres on 4 separate and adjoining parcels, plus a portion of the abutting right-of-way of Quince Orchard Road. The applicant filed the proposed annexation petition with the City of Gaithersburg to reclassify the site from the county's R200 and NR .75 height 45 zones to the City of Gaithersburg's mixed-use development zone. This review is based on Maryland's local government state law. As you see here, the code is 416B, where it states different land use or density. Without the express approval of the county commissioners or county council of the county in which the municipality is located, for 5 years after an annexation by a municipality, the municipality may not allow development of the annexed land for land uses substantially different than the authorized use, or at a substantially higher density, not exceeding 50%, than could be granted for the proposed development, in accordance with the zoning classification of the county applicable at the time of annexation. Basically, it cannot develop for more than the densities higher than 50% of what can be approved by the county for 5 years unless allowed by the city council. What you're seeing here on this slide is the R200 or parcel E. Parcel B, as noted to the right here in the NR, is 0.6 acres. Parcel C is 5.45 acres. Parcel D, 3 acres. The site is surrounded by a mix of commercial and residential uses. Properties to the north and west of the site are zoned R200 and are improved with a combination of single-family detached houses and townhomes. The property directly to the south of the site, on the opposite side of Darnestown Road, is zoned R200 and is improved with the Quince Orchard Public High School. The properties to the east are located, for the most part, within the City of Gaithersburg limit and are zoned C1, local commercial, and improved with low-density commercial uses. The petition for annexation previously proposed 305 units of housing and an added maximum of 285,000 square feet of commercial space, totaling 375,000 square feet of commercial use and a half acre park space. It was well over the county maximum at the time and 50% higher per the state annotated code. Since this was a revised proposal, all of the master plan analysis previously regarding parks, enclave, etc. still stands. This is the conceptual development plan currently proposed, totaling 110 residential units in parcel E, 28 single-family units and 82 townhomes, and 10,000 square feet of commercial development on parcel B, C, and D. The applicant is also willing to commit to the following: the mix and total number of proposed units, MPDUs, and workforce housing units, and at least 1 acre of open space. The slide you have before you is the data table that you will also find in the staff report. This analysis, also located on page 7 of the staff report as mentioned, demonstrates the total proposed development is not greater than 50% of what could be allowed on the entire property under the current zoning, with a 74 total units allowed per the zoning ordinance times 1.5 per the state annotated code of the developed land equals 111 units. Currently proposed 110 units. There are corrections to the staff report, particularly on page 7. As you'll note up here, previously noted 288,077 square feet should be accurately reflected as 228,077 square feet. Page 8, we want to add to the note, staff received approximately 180 letters and emails opposing the annexation petition. Of the 180 opposing correspondence, approximately 165 community members submitted a signed form letter. The opposing petitions assert the following. As mentioned, and as you see before you, all opposing petitions assert the following. The proposed development would increase traffic and safety concerns. Annexation will create an enclave or an area that is in the city of Gaithersburg but surrounded by Montgomery County. The proposed development would also increase school enrollment and would be inconsistent between the city of Gaithersburg 150% APFO and Montgomery County's 120 APFO. Concerns persist regarding the increased residential density, and the city of Gaithersburg could approve development exceeding the current proposal. Staff also received approximately 5 emails supporting the current annexation. The email messages state that the current proposal offers smarter urban development that blends with its context. I would like to also continue to note the staff, after the staff report was filed, staff received over 30 additional emails opposing the petition for annexation and 1 email supporting the annexation. The letters expressed deep concern regarding the opposition of the annexation. The letters expressed deep concern regarding the strain on already crowded roads, increase in class size, increased capacity, and potential burden on utilities, including water and sanitation, and pedestrian safety. Concerns also persist regarding the development of 110 townhouses on Parcel E, which is currently zoned R20 and allows for only 30 single-family units. I want to note, as part of the letters opposing, the form letter and as well as the personalized letters are attached in the staff report you received. Staff recommends approval to transmit the following comments to the Montgomery County Council and the City of Gaithersburg. The development proposed with this application does not include land uses that are substantially different than the authorized uses under the current zoning and is not more than 150% of the density that could be granted for the entire property under the zoning classifications of Montgomery County at the time of annexation. That's all that staff has at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, does the applicant want to make a presentation or?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, Bob Harris of Lurch Early Brewer representing the applicant. On my right is Josh Sloan from VICA Engineers, who's been doing the planning work on this. On my left is Stuart Barr, my partner, who's been working together with me on this. And farther still to the left is Russell Johnson. He is the property owner. Mr. Johnson will speak first. Josh Sloan will walk you through the project a little bit more, and then I have some more substantive remarks, if we may. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you again for the time and the opportunity.
If you could just pull your mic up a little closer.
Sorry.
That'd be great.
Okay.
And yeah,
Sorry.
make sure it's turned red. There you go.
All right, I'll get there. But thank you again for the time and the opportunity again to present a substantially revised plan. For over 55 years, my family has owned that site in Gaithersburg. It was bought as a farm and for a commercial nursery and garden center. We operated the garden center on the site for 45 years. At the time of the purchase of the property, the entire surrounding area for miles was zoned agricultural. We have been very close with the community and Montgomery County over those years. Over those 45 years, we hired hundreds of employees from the surrounding community, including giving many hundreds of high school students their very first job, especially Quince Orchard High School students. Additional and customer involvement over those 45 years was to support the community through donations and other requests for local community events and needs. Johnson's presently has 2 stores in the county, as well as our headquarters located in Kensington. My personal involvement and support for the community runs deep, most recently over the last 12 years with the local Boy Scout Troop 1094, which I just stepped down from being Scoutmaster last June. I believed our initial mixed plan use for the property made sense, but realized many mistakes regarding the plan itself. I learned it was way too dense. After some community opposition, I decided to re-engage the community and to revise the plan. I've done so in a major way. We have had 2 large community meetings and numerous smaller meetings. There is an overview in the attachment 2 of the staff report. I appreciate the support from some of the community, but also realize that some will not support the new plan. I hope that you will support our revised plan. Josh Sloan will now briefly walk you through the huge changes that we've made.
Good morning, Joshua Sloan, Director of Planning and Landscape Architecture with VICA. I'm just going to quickly walk through a couple of the changes. As Russell noted, he asked us to go back to the drawing board, come up with a new plan based on the community meetings we had and some internal ideas we had about how we could expand the space, the open spaces, and deal with some of the compatibility issues. We basically started with a new direction on the number of units, and so we decreased the total unit count about 69% and eliminated all of the multifamily housing. So this brought it down to the 110 units possible on the site. Then we worked with the open space to centralize it. We had actually some concern about the open space being on the periphery, and they thought it would be more appropriate if it was internal, and the single-family homes were actually the sort of a buffer to the open space itself. And this centralized location gave us a good opportunity to both expand the space because of the odd shape of the lot, and also get some nice frontages for street-facing homes and open space facing towns, and then a buffer between the single-family houses and the existing houses. I think Bob will talk more about the specific open space sizes, but the open field, we made sure it was large enough to accommodate a junior soccer field, and then added a separate playground area that's quite large so that they wouldn't be competing for space, and they could both be used at the same time. Given the topography of the site, this will also allow us to get stormwater off of the open play field down in the corner where it expands in the larger area. Also, the towns were consolidated a little bit more and brought entirely to the east side of the plan. So they're really a transition from the commercial area to the single-family area. Finally, the commercial itself, we looked at that. We've done some tweaks to the plan on how we could accommodate better circulation, queuing, stacking, things that are a little bit thinking ahead what we're going to have to do with schematic development plan if this moves forward. But the big change was removing all of the additional density and really only allowing for a small increase for some kind of small either expansion of a pad site or the Safeway of 10,000 square feet. The rest of the commercial density was taken off of the plan. So that's what we were asked to do and put this together. We really also wanted to try to give a sense of the character of how this would look and fit with the community, so it's much more detailed design than we presented earlier in this sketch plan that was a bubble diagram and massing that I think really kind of confused some people, and this helped them see what we could really do.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Just to reiterate, as Mr. Baio positioned before, we will be including in the annexation agreement with the City of Gaithersburg a commitment to the various conditions that he mentioned, the maximum number of units, the minimum open space, and the maximum additional commercial space. And so those will become part of that agreement. The second thing I want to point out is that, like your legal staff, I too have studied the annexation statute in terms of the ability to annex and to develop, and I've looked at the legislative history of that statute as well, and believe that both the plain language of the statute as well as the intent of the drafters is to allow this type of annexation to occur given the limited expansion above the potential under the existing zoning. And I'll talk about that a little bit. I do want to reinforce graphically for you some of the dramatic changes here. The slide before you shows the increase in what we're calling the park space. Technically, it won't be public park; it'll be privately owned, but open for play. And that's not all the green space on the property. That's that central open space. It grew significantly because we did get a lot of comments about providing that kind of space. Secondly, the density has decreased significantly, and this bar chart is to scale, and it shows what was proposed in the original plan and what is being proposed now. It's really one of the more dramatic, probably the most dramatic change from a initial plan to a revised plan that I've ever handled, but we believe this is what is appropriate for the site. The third thing I wanted to point out here, and this goes to what I call the 150% rule, and that is that if you note the the bars here, again, drawn to scale, what we're proposing now is the far right bar. What is in the second bar from the left is what is allowed under existing zoning today. So and then the middle bar there, or the right middle bar, is what the 150% rule would allow. And so not only are we well under the 150% rule, but we're actually under what the current zoning would allow as well. And that's why I feel comfortable that it fits within the statute. I want to touch upon a few of the reasons that we think this is good policy, irrespective of whether we have the right to do it under the 150% rule. I just think it's good planning. We're all familiar with the growth forecasts for the county and the region, and the COG 9.0 forecast says there's going to be about 278,000 more people in the county by the year 2045, requiring 138,000 new housing units. And as you see on this graph that I've edited there to highlight things, a major percentage of that is going to happen within the Gaithersburg vicinity. And so we're trying to address that. Secondly, I want to remind you that you're well aware of the housing element of the county general plan. Recognized that we only have about 4% of county land that's zoned for development that remains undeveloped, and that not all of that is developable. So we're struggling to find new places to have housing that we can do. And the housing element says it's clear that the county's housing needs cannot be met by the traditional patterns of low-density development. That means infill sites like this, and you see them every week now, are the future of development in the county. So we think we're consistent with that. There's another important benefit here, though, that hasn't really been addressed. And when I was preparing for this, I did some research, and I realized that until relatively recently, Gaithersburg, as a city, had no MPDU ordinance. And so all of Kentlands and all of Lakelands, very big communities, were built without MPDUs. Similarly, Montgomery County, until the changes that they made in 2004, all for sale MPDUs burned off in terms of their obligations after 20 years. So if an MPDU unit for sale was built in 1980, by 2000, it didn't have to be an MPDU unit anymore. We changed that in 2004, and now it keeps repeating itself, so the period recycles. But what that means is that in the zip code where this property is, there are only 8 total MPDUs, for sale MPDUs, existing today. There were a lot previously, but they expired over time because most of the development occurred in the 80s and 90s. So Gaithersburg does now have an MPDU ordinance that requires both MPDUs and workforce housing units, and so we will be providing significant affordable housing for the region there. In terms of the master plan, there certainly is some discussion about how we conform with that or not. I believe we do. The current zoning on half this property is neighborhood retail that allows way more than what we're proposing there. And the county master plan for the western portion of this does say that they recommend it for a park purchase, but it also says that if it's not purchased for the park, it would be an appropriate site for single-family and townhouse mixed. And it even goes on to say that townhouse zoning could be implemented through a sectional map amendment. Now, we're effectively doing that through the annexation, but what happened is the county did not acquire it. And so here we are a number of years later, and we are working to implement the alternative recommendation in the master plan. We are, by the way, providing substantial open space for the public that the county didn't have to buy, and we think we're fulfilling a large part of that recommendation as well. The city's master plan has dealt with this site for a long time, and it recommends not only that it be within the maximum expansion limits that you see before you here, something that has been approved for a number of years, but that the master plan calls for MXD zoning, which is exactly the zoning that we are seeking. Irrespective of all that, I think it's a good location for this mix of uses. It's a 23-acre site at the intersection of 2 state highways. It's walkable to extensive neighborhood retail shopping. There's more extensive retail than that, and entertainment in the Kentlands very nearby. All three of the schools, the high school, the middle school, the elementary, are actually within walking distance of this site. And there is immediate access to bus service, a couple different routes. For a mid-county site, no, this is not downtown Silver Spring, but it is a very walkable site. I ran the score on walkscore.com, and it comes out at a score of 74. That's considered very walkable. That's pretty special in a mid-county site like this. But it's also close to the Life Sciences Center, to the Gaithersburg and Rockville Job Centers, and to the whole technology corridor. So we think it's well situated for development like that. Lastly, it is compatible, we believe, with existing development. You see the concept plan here before you. We didn't put the context in there, but there are residential homes to the left and above this, and then a big part of this is commercial, that it serves as a transition between that and those single families. We think the density, which works out to be about just on the 14 acres, about 7.8 units per acre, is well within the range of townhouse densities that the planning board regularly approves. So we think it's a good thing to do. I'll note finally that we do meet both the county and the city's school capacity tests. So this is not a situation where we're trying to ignore a test. We happen to meet both of them, and we believe that it's a good plan, and we would like your support for it. If I have any time remaining, I'd like to listen to the community comments and, if possible, respond to any of their questions or comments. But I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have some speakers. David Lee, Carol Scott, Jeff Silva, and Karen Dillon Willery for starters. So I put everybody on a 3-minute timer. I don't cut you off, but I just do that really to kind of just remind you of how you're doing on time. All I ask is that you just don't repeat things that have already been said by somebody else, but I'm not going to rigidly enforce any time limits. But if you could just try to keep it concise, that's all I ask. Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first.
Hello. Let's see if I can read this right. Hello, esteemed members of the Montgomery County Planning Board and staff. My name is David Lee. I am the PTA president for Thurgood Marshall Elementary School in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Future residents and their children at the Johnson property under review will ultimately feed to Thurgood Marshall Elementary, Ridgeview, and Quince Orchard High School. I had testified last fall on November 12th to communicate my strong disagreement with the Johnson property annexation plan, and I was happy to see that the planning board staff had made a detailed report outlining a decision to not recommend annexation based on use being significantly higher density than what was zoned. Furthermore, the planning board had recommended to convey that report to the county council for the egregious increase in density that was proposed then. Given our over 600 letters that were included in that last report, I hope that you understand how strongly our neighborhoods did and do not want high-density development at the Johnson property. Since that day, I have attended numerous meetings with the Johnsons, every meeting, and his PR team and attorneys. I've heard them speak to our community about receiving feedback to help draw up a better plan. What I see in their new plan before you today does not take into account the most important aspect of the feedback that was given to the Johnson team again and again. No high-density residential development on the Johnson property. I personally and directly said this to Mr. Johnson himself and his team in 2 separate meetings with both our local PTA and HOA leaders. This has never been a question of development. It has always been a question of high-density development. And for the Johnson team to think that cramming 110 residential units into a parcel that is zoned for up to 34 units is absolutely absurd. What is even more puzzling is a report by the planning board staff that confirms that the calculations are valid for including all parcels, but doesn't take into account density in one parcel. How can anyone explain logically that the point of our state code that limits maximum development at 150% density above an area of multiple parcels can somehow be squeezed into one parcel? That is literally going directly against the intent of the code's max limit in the first place. I want to reiterate quickly our reasons for why we're against annexation and rezoning. I will talk about schools and overcrowding, and I know that they mentioned about being under the max limits there, the max threshold. A couple of quick numbers. Current enrollment at Thurgood Marshall Elementary School, 665. That's for this school year. Program capacity are 535. So currently 125% above program capacity. Student generation rates, if we do the calculations on their 28 singles and 82 townhomes, they're going to add 28 additional students, which would put us, the projections go up every year, just to be clear, not significantly, but they go up every year for Thurgood Marshall specifically. So you add 28 to 665, you get 693, which puts us, Thurgood Marshall, at 129% over program capacity. And that's, as you said, I'm not going to do a year every year, but in that general range. I understand that obviously the threshold is based on the cluster, but at the very least you can understand where we are at Thurgood Marshall. And just to be, once again, reiterate, all residents will feed to Thurgood Marshall there. Pedestrian safety, I'll mention again, is an issue. I can tell you that I actually personally witnessed the ambulances attending a pedestrian that was struck this past Saturday at the intersection. I can point it out there. Oh, it's not on that slide, but it's really at that main intersection there, Route 28 and 124. This was this past Saturday on Father's Day weekend in the morning. So public safety is a concern, obviously, especially with Consortia High School directly across the street. And everybody knows about the enclave aspect as well. In conclusion, I'm directly questioning the validity of the interpretation that the Johnson team and planning board staff have used to justify their maximum use under a 150%. Given that there's no precedence for this interpretation of the law, I hope that the planning board will see through this fuzzy math and recommend once again against annexation and rezoning for the Johnson property with a 5-year moratorium on development. Putting 110 residential units into Parcel E will have a disproportionate impact not only on Parcel E, but also the adjacent Willow Ridge single-family homes that are of significantly less density, which once again goes against the master plan of keeping within similar density to the surrounding communities. Finally, I will say the number 51. That is 150% of 34 units for Parcel E. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to speak next?
I will go next. Push the button. Okay. Good morning. I'm Dr. Carol Scott. I'm a resident of Willow Ridge, which is one of the neighborhoods directly adjacent to the 14-acre parcel that's being discussed. I'm here to oppose the annexation and rezoning and encourage you to once again vote in favor of the 5-year moratorium as you appropriately did back in November. My primary reason for stating this position is because the proposed land use is still at a significantly higher density than the current zoning, which makes the moratorium appropriate and the responsible thing to do. The math that was done in the report is creative and dubious and frankly deceptive, because it does not represent accurately the property. I understand that there is no precedent for doing the math in this fashion, and I urge you, this is a very slippery slope, don't go down it. Imagine for a moment if we have a property owner with 10 parcels of land that are each zoned for 30 housing units. He can come in and say, I want to put 449, which is 150% minus 1 of the total for all of his land on one parcel. And there would be a precedent for it if you establish that. Please don't go there. That is clearly outside the intent of the state statute. Clearly. My second point is about the enclave. I was trying to think of what could be the best analogy I could give looking around my home, and I brought my wooden spoon here. If I set it like this or like this, it doesn't become part of the table. The vast majority of it is still surrounded by air. Not the table. Same with the Johnson property. There is a tiny little portion that connects the city of Gaithersburg, and the rest is surrounded by county property. The enclave issue is still an issue. Another reason I have for objecting has to do with school capacity and the school projections. Gaithersburg standards, which are appallingly lax with their new APFO standard of 150%, is ludicrous. A classroom that's designed for 20 kids should not have to try to accommodate 30. And when we look at how the developers do their projections for housing, it's an underestimation for areas like ours because there's absolutely nothing that factors in parameters like proximity to mass transit, proximity to major roads, proximity to desired schools. None of that is factored in. So if we said we're going to build 100 brand-new townhomes in the complex right next to Shady Grove Metro Station, right next to the metro station, easy access to I-270, IC-370, and the ICC, but not at all walkable to a good school, and 100 townhouses on this lot, the projections would be exactly the same for the number of students in elementary school, middle school, and high school. Anyone with common sense knows that that's ridiculous, but that's how the projections are done. So even with the 150%, they're still going to be grossly underestimating the impact on the schools. This is not acceptable. Throw into that the fact that all 3 of the schools that service this property sit outside the city limits. You're now enabling the city, with their lax standards, to impact significantly the population of all 3 of these schools when the rest of the residents who feed into these schools have no say-so. It is simply not right. My next issue has to do with traffic, which you've heard from other people, so I won't go into too much, but the traffic in front of this property is a nightmare, and what they've proposed only makes it worse, significantly worse. There is absolutely nothing here to mitigate the traffic problems. I also take issue with the suggestion that the community input was implemented in this new proposal. I would argue that it very, very strongly was not. I attended these public meetings, and frankly, they felt like a charade. It felt like a farce. One quick example, they brought in a traffic study team, and when neighbors were trying to ask questions about the new plan, the traffic team could not identify or locate on the map either of the 2 roads that access the property. It was not well received. People were not happy. They were more insulted than placated. I'm also concerned about the entire appearance that the government agencies are bending over backwards to accommodate the wishes of one landowner at the significant detriment of literally thousands of other neighbors who live around this property who will be impacted in terms of school overcrowding and traffic. That is simply not right. Absolutely not right. I also take issue with the description of, by Mr. Bayo, of the form letters signed by 165 neighbors who wrote in about this. Frankly, people in our neighborhood are tired of going through this over and over and over just because they don't get what they want the first time, so they try to come back and take a second bite of the apple. I personally saw a lot of those emails, and yes, they did have the same foundation, but people put their own statements, their own input in there, and a large, large number of them, I heard from many people in my neighborhood whose comments, including my own, are not in the report. We also are overwhelmed by the lack of transparency with government processes in general. Trying to find out what's going on with this has been extremely difficult, and even getting information, it was often contradictory, which makes it even more frustrating and more difficult to keep people apprised of what's going on. One specific point that I find objectionable, and I don't know if this was you or someone else, in September of 2014, the change in the zoning code for the 9-acre parcel from the prior C1 code to the new NR code. We had no knowledge this was happening, no opportunity to give any input. We just found out after the fact that the code had been changed. If this property still had the C1 code that it had prior to September 2014, this whole discussion would be moot because there would be 0 housing allowed on the 9-acre property, and the only housing that would be allowed would be the 34 houses, single-family homes on the 14-acre lot, and 150% of that, as David stated, is 51. It is not 110. Please listen to the constituents and not just one rich guy with a big team of people behind him. The 5-year moratorium on this property is appropriate. In closing, I actually have a couple of questions for all of you. I don't know if this is the time to pose them or later, but I do have a couple of questions.
Let's hear them.
Okay. My first one is I would like to hear the justification for the closed meeting to discuss with legal counsel this particular issue that was added to the agenda yesterday. I would like that on the record, and I would like you to clarify the statutes that authorize that as opposed to a completely open forum.
Well, gladly. We're discussing what the annexation statute means and its interpretation. And the reason that we do that in closed session is because you can appreciate that sometimes the board might choose to assert a legal position or not assert it, and the staff needs to advise us on whether or not we're on firm ground to do that.
And why does that need to be behind closed doors?
Well, we need to understand what the limits of our legal authority are because we need to act in conformity with the law, the staff may not want to express in public what they think are the outer limits of that authority. That's, I think, a pretty routine thing that government agencies do, because, I mean, you can appreciate that we have no leverage if, for example, the staff, and I'm not saying this is what they told us, if the staff said we had no basis for asserting that an application could be denied under the statute, that would certainly hamstring our ability to press the applicant to do a course of action that we thought was in the public interest. Now, obviously, in most cases, not that clear cut, but I think you get my drift.
All right. My second question is, I would like to know what happened to the position of People's Counsel. I know that previously Montgomery County employed an attorney with the title People's Counsel, whose job was to help community members understand their rights and have effectively participate in the planning process. I know this position used to exist, and I'm curious what happened to it and who, if anyone, has filled that void.
I think that's a little far afield for this setting. I think we could probably direct you to somebody who could tell you the backstory on that, but I really, with respect, just don't think that's something we can really get into that right now. It really had nothing to do with the planning board, so that's
Okay.
the short answer.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, I can't really,
Yeah,
you know.
the People's Counsel actually was very helpful to the communities in dealing with the Johnsons previously, and that's why I asked that question.
Okay, it's outside of I think it's enough for us to just observe that it had nothing to do with us one way or the other.
Okay. I would also like to state one last thing. There were many, many, many neighbors who also would have liked to have been here, who asked me to speak on their behalf, but because they have jobs and were not able to take off, are not able to be here. But we are by far a small representative of a very large number of people who share the same opinion.
Okay, thank you. Who is next?
Hello? I see by your schedule that you're going to go on till 9 p.m. this evening. My compliments to your commitment to public service. I too share Mr. Kim and Carol Dewey Scott's comments about the loading of the allowable development between all the parcels to be put on that one single parcel E, and then form the calculation and to come up using the Maryland Code formula. So basically, what ends up, I agree with their objection to the 110 units on that parcel based on that erroneous calculation or process. Now, also, I think also the point that was come up with about the about our president, that's important. But her point about the annexation, if you look, it's across that intersection. Now, that access from the city of Gaithersburg into the proposed annex properties would be only intermittent, basically from 5 a.m. to 12 a.m. You cannot access it on a steady basis. It only works if you've got the crosswalk or if your automobile has the green. So your access from between the city of Gaithersburg to this proposed annexed properties, it's tenuous. It only exists after 12 a.m. on a constant basis when the light is flashed, and you could access it by foot constantly or by car, uninterrupted. But I also want to make mention that the county's approval to raise the taxes to correct the inequity of the current lack of our education capacity of our schools, if that exists, should not the county planning department cooperate by not making the problem worse with this additional development of 110 units all on one parcel? Once that gets accomplished, then after the 5-year delay and the mixed use classification is obtained, then you will be stuck with the development going up to 4, maybe 6 stories on the remaining parcels. And all that population will have to be serviced by the county, which will be stuck with the tab and the city of Gaithersburg gets all the advantage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. I am a resident of Willow Ridge community. I've lived there for 10 years, and...
Tell us your name.
I'm so sorry. My name is Karen Dillon-Mullery.
Thank you.
Pretty much everyone has said everything that I have put in here. But what I do want to say is that I don't think anyone is opposed to the Johnsons developing their land. I don't think that anyone is saying, we don't want you to make use of this. It's the way it is being proposed that it will be developed. You know, we move there, we live there in our community, in this area of the county, in this neighborhood, because we want this suburban area. We don't want to live in the downtown crown. We don't want to be in, you know, the urban center of the suburbs. And that's what this development feels like it's going to do, especially when you're talking about the area that will be developed for, you know, retail use. At some point, it becomes a quality of life issue and a safety issue, and I don't think that the Johnsons would want to live in an area themselves where they feel like their children are not safe, or they have to leave 20 minutes earlier just to get out of their neighborhood to get to work, which is what's happening. So I would like to ask that you put the 5-year moratorium on this annexation and things can be revisited. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more speakers. Steve Gammarino. I see Joshua Sloan is listed, but I think he's with the applicant. And I see a couple of our lawyers that I think are with the applicant, so maybe it's just one more. I'm sorry, if I'd known that, I would have called you up with everybody else. But you've got the floor all to yourself.
Great.
So.
I was going to say good morning, but good afternoon. My name is Steve Gammarino, and I represent the Hidden Ponds HOA, which is directly adjacent to the Johnson property and will be significantly affected by this annexation. Although the Johnson property has revised its application, I think many of the reasons cited by the Montgomery County Planning Department to deny the original proposal remain the same. This includes creating an enclave within the county, increased overcrowding of the area schools, zoning that is inconsistent with the county master plan, traffic and safety issues, and of course, the lack of community support. All these issues have been well documented to the planning board by area residents and staff of the planning board. As it stands, if this annexation and rezoning takes place, it will result in unprecedented consequences of the North Potomac and residents of the county. Today, I would like to touch on 2 specific areas. First, we think the annexation of the Johnson property by the city of Gaithersburg creates an enclave that is not consistent with the state's prerequisite that the property to be annexed be contiguous and adjoining to the municipality. If the annexation is allowed, the Johnson property will be completely surrounded by Montgomery County, resulting in area residents have little or no voice in matters affecting the adjacent properties. Let me give you an example. Today, any development in our community must abide by the county's Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, or the APFO, for the Quince Orchard Cluster, which of course today is 120%. Under criteria established by the county, these schools today, which would serve children for the developed Johnson property, are already deemed to be inadequate relative to the capacity for the students. Yet once annexed, the Johnson property developer would adhere not to the county's standard, but to the city of Gaithersburg, much higher AFPO of 150% per school. I ask you, would you want this outcome for each of your children? Also, since Montgomery County's Planning Board last November reviewed and approved the Potomac Valley Shopping Center annexation by Gaithersburg, which sits diagonally across the Johnson property, the city has taken steps to increase the proposed building height limits and change the boundaries of the annexed property. This boundary change has created a county enclave within the city of Gaithersburg. We therefore question Gaithersburg annexation of the Potomac Valley Shopping Center property as recently modified, and whether or not it meets the minimum prerequisites required by state law. I ask you, is the alteration of an annexation plan and boundaries after the county's approval appropriate? If it is, we are concerned that the annexation of the Johnson property by Gaithersburg will result in zoning limits inconsistent with what's going to be allowed and could adversely affect the county and the surrounding neighborhoods. Second and last, we are absolutely baffled by the Montgomery County Planning Staff zoning analysis of the Johnson property revised development plan. Even though this proposal is not consistent with the Greater Seneca Science Corridor Master Plan and the Johnson property of 110 residential units in Parcel E is almost 4 times the county zoning limit for this parcel, the staff report concluded that, and I quote, "The development proposed with this revised annexation petition will not contain substantially different uses than currently allowed." What? If one goes by this interpretation presented in this report, which allows the aggregation of zoning for each parcel to be applied to any one parcel of land, one could conceivably put a building with the density of the Empire State Building on one parcel of land being annexed. This interpretation defies common sense and is unprecedented. If it is allowed, it will result in little or no assurances that existing zoning in the county means anything. I ask you, does this make any sense? Rather, shouldn't one interpret this provision by the existing zoning for each parcel, especially when the parcels to be annexed have very different zoning like the Johnson property? In closing, given these facts, I urge the Planning Board to deny the annexation and rezoning of the Johnson property. I thank you for the time and our opportunity to voice our view.
Thank you. Okay, any questions or comments right off the bat for either for any of the speakers or the staff? I should say on the issue of the schools, which seems to be a big part of the concern on the part of the community, my understanding, and I'm prepared to be correct on this, is that the question in front of the board is rather narrow. It's about whether or not this meets the criteria for annexation, which has some contiguity element to it, although it's not entirely clear what the test is of whether or not it's sufficiently contained within or abutting the existing incorporated limits of the municipality. And the second part is whether or not the proposed development is in excess of 150% of the zoning for the properties that are proposed to be incorporated. So it's not my understanding that school capacity at this stage is in front of us, that's a separate consideration that applies at the time of whenever the property is actually developed. If it's annexed, it would be an application that's submitted to the city of Gaithersburg, and they would review it and decide whether it conformed to their school's test or not. If they're an application that's submitted when they're not incorporated, it would come to us, and at the time of development review, we would assess the school capacity. Am I stating that correctly? Okay. So I know that's not going to make anybody happy, but I just want to make it clear what it's within our authority today to decide and what it's not within our authority to decide or to consider. With that, I wanted to see what everybody thought, if they didn't have any questions.
You, Mr. Bello, can you go back and explain again this whole thing about the lots, the differences that R200 and other units are going there? Can you go through that?
Sure. Mentioned earlier regarding the lot R200. Do we have the slides? Can I bring my slides back up? So, as you see in the slides, R200 portion, parcel E, up to 34 units are allowed with MPDUs. And up to 34 units times 1.5 is approximately 51 units. And NR beneath it, as you see here, parcel B, C, and D, up to 40 units are permitted under the zone of NR .75, height 45, times 1.5 yields approximately 60, give or take, which then arrives at a total, if you combine the two, or however way you want to apply the math, yields 111 total units permitted combined on both sites. And so what we interpret, the staff interprets the state annotated code as municipality may not allow development of the annexed land for land use is substantially different than the authorized use. We see it as a comprehensive land analysis, and so that's how we arrived at the,
Well, I just want to make an observation here that I don't know if this has occurred to the rest of you. Maybe it has. The master plan recommendation for the R200 part of this property was, in the first instance, try to get it for parkland or some part of it parkland. Now, here's the problem. I think it's, to be honest, I wouldn't want to hang my hat on the argument that the properties have to be analyzed separately, and I wouldn't want to hang my hat on the argument that they have to be analyzed together. I think that's sort of I don't want to say it's an entirely open question, but I think it's at least an arguable point on either side. But here's the issue. If you were to insist that the R200 portion of the site could be developed with only 51 units, and that the rest of the units would have to go on the NR portion of the site, you're still going to wind up with the same number of units. The difference is you're not going to leave any room for an acre of basically what amounts to, whatever you want to call it, private open space, parkland, a large usable open area. And so, in effect, you sort of undercut the ability to achieve anything like what the original master plan recommendation was for. So, as I understand it, if you were to take the most aggressive interpretation of our authority, or the county council were to take the most aggressive interpretation of the authority and say, no, there can only be 51 on the R200 site, and the rest of the units have to go on the NR site, you get the same yield, but you wouldn't get the open space. So I'm not sure what purpose, how the public interest would be served by that. Except perhaps if you happen to live immediately next to the R200 site, in which case you'd rather look at less rather than more units. And I understand and respect that, but I'm just saying in terms of the big picture of what will happen to these two properties, it's not clear to me how the result is improved, even if you were to successfully assert the more expansive interpretation of the council's authority to limit development for 5 years on this site. So anyway, I just wanted to lay that out there because that was shaping my thinking about this.
And I agree with you 100%. There's no need to take, I mean, this is a decision that the county council will make. It's not our decision. So I feel comfortable with the recommendation that the staff is giving and just let them decide. We don't need to tell them exactly which way we're going to go, right? So
Well, I would.
I think it's up to them.
Here's my suggestion. See what you think of this. I mean, I would suggest pointing out what I just said, which is that, you know, one way or the other, the council cannot stop them from
Not at all.
annexing this site, and much less us. We're only advising the council, and the council's only ability is within the state statute, which would be at most to say where these units can go, not the total number of units.
That's a very fine point that I know you explained it once, but I hope that the adjacent residents are understanding what the chair is alluding to. It is the same yield, and therefore, the decision that we make, you know, even if we were to try to suggest or interpret here what ways you could argue that piece of the code, you know, and then the requirements for interpretation, you could arguably argue both ways. And so I don't want to go down that path either, but I'm in agreement with you that this is what they would be allowed one way or another. But the one way that the chair is talking about would wind up with the same number of units with a horrible configuration that isn't going to benefit those residents or anyone else. It wouldn't change the situation.
And I agree with that, and the only thing that I will add here is to emphasize that we need that open space. Make it
Yes.
clear to the county council that that's one.
And
Right, so-
that is directly related back to the master plan. So in our wisdom, in approving, you know, the plan that's in place, that was an important thing, and we're going to not be able to achieve that. Obviously, we don't have the control
Right.
once it's annexed, but.
Now, I would like to stay away from expressing an official opinion or taking a vote on what we think the statute means, because I don't think that's necessary, other than to point out to the council that perhaps they want to make sure that the commitment to providing that open space is in fact binding.
I agree with that.
So, I am sincerely sorry that it's beyond our ability to even consider many of the very reasonable concerns that some of the people testifying raised. But I think you understand what I'm saying. I think that they would be entitled, if Gaithersburg is willing, and I'll get to that in a minute. If Gaithersburg wants to annex this property, they can do it. And they could do it subject only to the limitation they couldn't approve basically more than 111 units, or at least within the next 5 years. So I don't see, and I don't think the board sees, what purpose is served by forcing them to put more of the units on the NR property at the expense of getting some usable public open space that you could even maybe put a soccer field or some other recreational facility on. Yeah, seriously, a soccer field. Maybe, I mean, an official soccer field takes about the full acre, but, so it might be a little bit pinched versus the official size. But my point here is that I don't think there's any, I don't think it necessarily accomplishes anything to try to force them to push the units onto the NR property. So, and I said I was going to come back to Gaithersburg. And I'm sorry I can't take more testimony. I'm just trying to explain myself here, because I listened to what you had to say, and I feel an obligation to explain what we're doing to you. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about it offline, but for right now, I'm just trying to get this on the record. As to Gaithersburg, there were a number of people who said things to the effect of, well, you know, if you allow them to do this, they could basically do whatever they want, up to 110, 111 units. Not really. The annexation statute does not say you can get up to 150% of whatever the zoning is the county applied and go, and you have a blank check. Gaithersburg does regulate land use. And in fact, I would submit, and I'm not saying, just saying this because one of our friends from Gaithersburg's planning staff is in the audience, but they do a highly professional job of it. So I think that the statute is based on the idea that municipalities are going to behave responsibly, that there's a process which allows for them to take over land use regulation from a county when they annex a property, and it's pretty limiting as to what the county can do about it if the if the annexation is within the ultimate limits of their developable area. So, all that having been said, I'd look for a motion, perhaps to the effect of what we've been talking about the open space and not opining on the ultimate legal question about the statute.
Gonna make it brief. I move to transmit comments as discussed to the Montgomery County Council and the City of Gettysburg. Is that okay?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, opposed? That's approved. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, sir.